It was useless for me to describe to you how terrible Violet, Klaus, and even Sunny felt in the time that followed. If you have ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels. And if you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine it. For the Baudelaire children, it was, of course, especially terrible because they lost both their parents at the same time. For several days they felt so miserable they could scarcely get out of bed. Klaus found he had little interest in books. The gears in Violet's inventive brain seemed to stop, and even Sunny, who of course was too young to really understand what was going on, bit things with less enthusiasm. Of course it didn't make things any easier that they had lost their home as well, and all their possessions. As I'm sure you know, to be in one's own room, in one's own bed, can often make a bleak situation a little better. But the beds of the Baudelaire orphans had been reduced to terrible rubble. Mr. Poe had taken them to the remains of the Baudelaire mansion to see if anything had been unharmed, and it was terrible. Violet's microscope had fused together in the heat of the fire. Klaus's favorite pen had turned to ash, and all of Sunny's teething rings had melted. Here and there the children could see traces of the enormous home they had loved. Fragments of their grand piano, an elegant bottle in which the Baudelaires kept brandy, the scorched cushions on the window seat where their mother liked to sit and read. Their home destroyed, the Baudelaires had recuperate from the terrible loss in the Poe household, which was not all agreeable. Mr. Poe was scarcely at home because he was very busy attending to the Baudelaire's affairs, and when he was home he was often coughing so much he could barely have a conversation. Miss Poe purchased clothing for the orphans that was in gratuitous colors and itched, and the two Poe children, Edgar and Albert, were loud and obnoxious boys with whom the Baudelaires had to share a tiny room that smelled of some sort of ghastly flower. But even given their surroundings, the children had mixed feelings when, over the dull dinner of boiled chicken, boiled potatoes, and branch of the blanched, here means boiled string beans, Mr. Poe announced that they were to leave the household the next morning. "Good," said Albert, who had a piece of potato stuck between his teeth. "Now we can get our room back. I'm tired of sharing it." Violet and Klaus had always mopped around there, never having any fun. "And the baby bites," Edgar said, tossing a chicken bone on the floor as if he were an animal in the zoo and not the son of a well-respected member of a banking community. "Where will we go?" Violet asked nervously. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to say something, but erupted into a brief fit of coughing. "I have made arrangements," he finally said, "for you to be raised by a distant relative of yours who lives on the other side of town. His name is Count Olaf." Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked at one another, unsure of what to think. On one hand, they didn't want to live with the Poes anymore. On the other hand, they had never heard of Count Olaf and don't know what he would be like. "Your parents will," Mr. Poe said, "instructs that you be raised in the most convenient way possible. Here in the city you'll be used to your surroundings, and this Count Olaf is your only relative who lives within the urban limits." Klaus thought this over for a minute as he swallowed on a chewy bit of bean. "But our parents never mentioned Count Olaf to us. Just how is he related to us exactly?" Poe sighed and looked down at Sunny, who had been biting a fork and listening closely. "He's either a third cousin 4 times removed or a fourth cousin 3 times removed. He is not your closest relative on the family tree, but he is the closest geographically, that's why. If he lives in the city," Violet says, "why didn't our parents ever invite him over?" "Possibly because he's very busy," Mr. Poe said. "He's an actor by trade and often travels around the world with various theater companies." "I thought he was a count," Klaus said. "He is both a count and an actor," Mr. Poe said. "Now, I don't mean to cut short our dinner, but you children have to pack up your things, and I have to return to the bank to do some more work. Like your new legal guardian, I am very busy myself." The 3 Baudelaire children had many more questions for Mr. Poe, but he had already stood up from the table with a slight wave of his hand, departed from the room. They heard him coughing into his handkerchief, and then the front door creaked shut, and he left the house. "Well," Miss Poe said, "you 3 had better start packing. Edgar, Albert, please help me clear the table." The Baudelaire orphans went to the bedroom and grumpily packed their few belongings. Klaus looked distastefully at each ugly sweater Mr. Poe had bought for them, and he folded them and put them into a small suitcase. Violet looked around the crumpled, smelly room in which they had been living, and Sunny crawled around solemnly, biting each of Edgar and Ellen's shoes, leaving small teeth marks into each one so she would not be forgotten. From time to time the Baudelaire children looked at one another, but with their futures such a mystery, they couldn't think of nothing to say. At bedtime they tossed and turned all night, scarcely getting any sleep between the loud snoring of Edgar and Albert, and their own worried thoughts. Finally Mr. Poe knocked on the door and snuck his head into the bedroom. "Rise and shine, Baudelaires," he said. "It's time for you to go to Count Olaf's." I looked around the crowded bedroom. Even though she didn't like it, she felt very nervous about leaving. "Do we have to go right this minute?" she asked. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but had to cough a few times before he began. "Yes, you do. I'm dropping you off on my way to the bank, so we need to leave soon as possible. Please get out of bed and get dressed," he said briskly. The word briskly means quickly, so as to get the Baudelaire children to leave the house. The Baudelaire children left the house. Mr. Poe's automobile rumbled along the cobblestone streets, the city towards the neighborhood where Count Olaf lived. They passed horse-drawn carriages and motorcycles along the Dordogne Drive. They passed the Frickle Fountain and the elaborately carved monument that occasionally spat out water in which the young children played. They passed the enormous pile of dirt in which the royal garden once stood. Before long, Mr. Poe drove the car down a narrow alley lined with houses made of pale brick and stopped halfway down the block. "Here we are," Mr. Poe said, in a voice undoubtedly meant to be cheerful. "Your new home." The Baudelaire children looked down and saw the prettiest house in the block. The bricks were clean and very well, and though the wide and open windows could see an assortment of well-groomed plants, standing in the doorway, hands on a shiny brass doorknob, was an elderly woman, smartly dressed, who was smiling at the children. In one hand she carried a flower pot. "Hello there," she called out. "You must be the children Count Olaf is adopting." Violet opened the door of the automobile and got out to shake the woman's hand. It felt firm and warm, and for the first time in a long while, Violet felt as if her life and the lives of her siblings might turn out well after all. "Yes," she said, "we are. I'm Violet Baudelaire, this is my brother Klaus, and my sister Sunny. And this is Mr. Poe, who has been arranging things for us since the death of our parents." "Yes, I heard about that accident," the woman said. "As everyone said, how do you do? I am Justice Strauss." "That is an unusual first name," Klaus remarked. That it is my title," she exclaimed. "Not my first name. I serve on the judge of the High Court." "How fascinating," Violet said. "And are you married to Count Olaf?" "Goodness me, no," Justice Strauss says. "I don't actually know him that well. He is my next-door neighbor." The children looked from the well-scrubbed house of Justice Strauss to the dilapidated one next door. The bricks were stained with soot and grime. There were two small windows which were closed and the shades drawn, even though it was a nice day. Rising above the windows was a tall and dirty tower tilted slightly to the left. The front door needed to be repainted, and carved in the middle of it was an image of an eye. The entire building sagged to the side like a crooked tooth. "Oh," said Sunny. Everyone knew what she meant. She meant, "What a terrible place. I don't want to live there at all." "Well, it was nice to meet you," Violet said to Justice Strauss. "Yes," said Justice Strauss, gesturing her flower pot. "Perhaps one day you could come over and help me with my gardening." "That would be very pleasant," Violet said, very sadly. It would, of course, be very pleasant to help Justice Strauss with her gardening, but Violet could not help thinking that it would be far more pleasant to live in Justice Strauss's house instead of Count Olaf's. What kind of man, Violet wondered, would carve an image of an eye onto his front door? Mr. Poe tipped his hat to Justice Strauss, who smiled at the children and disappeared into her lovely house. Klaus stepped forward and knocked on Count Olaf's door, his knuckles rapping right in the middle of the carved eye. There was a pause and the door creaked open. The children saw Count Olaf for the first time. "Hello, hello, hello," Count Olaf said in a wheezy whisper. He was very tall, very thin, dressed in a gray suit, and had many dark stains on it. His face was unshaven. Rather than two eyebrows like most human beings have, he had just one long one. His eyes were very, very shiny, which made him look both hungry and angry. "Hello, my children. Please step into your new house and wipe your feet outside so no mud gets indoors." As they stepped into the house, Mr. Poe behind them, the Baudelaire orphans realized how ridiculous things Count Olaf had just said. The room in which they'd found themselves was the dirtiest one they'd ever seen. A little bit of mud from the outdoors would not have made a bit of difference. Even in the dim light of one of the light bulbs that was hanging from the ceiling, the three children could see that everything in this room was filthy. From the stuffed head of a lion, which was nailed to the wall, to the bowl of apples cores which sat on a small wooden table. Klaus willed himself not to cry as he looked around. "This room looks like it needs a little work," Mr. Poe said, peering around the gloom. "I realize that my humble home isn't as fancy as the Baudelaire mansion," Count Olaf said, "but perhaps with a bit of your money we could fix it up a little nicer." Poe's eyes widened in surprise. His cough echoed the dark room before he spoke. "The Baudelaire fortune," he said sternly, "will not be used for such matter. In fact, it will not be used at all, till Violet is of age." Count Olaf turned to Mr. Poe with a glint in his eye, like an angry old dog. For a moment Violet thought he was going to strike Mr. Poe across the face, but then he swallowed. The children could see his Adam's apple bob in his skinny throat, and shrugged his patchy shoulders. "All right, then," he said. "It's the same to me. Thank you very much, Mr. Poe, for bringing them here. Children, I will now show you to your room." "Goodbye, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny," Mr. Poe said, stepping back through the front door. "I hope that you will be very happy here. I will continue to see you occasionally, and you can always contact me at the bank if you have any questions." "But we don't even know where the bank is," Klaus said. "I have a map of the city," Count Olaf said. "Goodbye, Mr. Poe." He leaned forward and shut the door, and the Baudelaire orphans were too overcome by the despair to get the last glimpse of Mr. Poe. They now wished that they could stay at the Poe household, even though it smelled. Rather than looking at the door, then the orphans looked down and saw that although Count Olaf was wearing shoes, he wasn't wearing any socks. They could see a space of pale skin between his tattered trousers and cuffs, his black shoes. That Count Olaf had an image of an eye tattooed on his ankle, matching the eye on the front door. They wondered how many other eyes were in Count Olaf's house, and whether for the rest of their lives they would always feel as though Count Olaf was watching them, even when he wasn't nearby.